Welcome to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. We're now on episode number 571. My name is Camden Busey. I'm pastor of Hope Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Grays Lake, Illinois. We've got a really fun episode lined up for you today with a lot of excellent friends and wonderful theologians and scholars. So let me start introducing to you our panel today. We have back with us our good friend, Dan Ragusa. Dan is a PhD student at Westminster Theological Seminary. He's calling in here on video from New York. Welcome back, Dan. It's great to speak with you and see you today.
Thanks, Ken, and good to be here as always.
Yeah, and we also have with us, some of you watching on video already see in our video panels there, introducing first, we have Cory Brock, Dr. Cory Brock, who's pastor at First Presbyterian Church, PCA, in Jackson, Mississippi. He's also on faculty at Belhaven University teaching biblical studies. Welcome back, Cory. It's great to speak with you.
Thanks, Camden. Glad to be here.
I don't know if we did video last time we spoke. We've only been doing this really regularly for the last couple months, and so it's good to connect with you and to see what's going on. We need to send you some books. Did you just move into your office? I'm doing a bust your chops too much, but you're like the antithesis of our other friend David Filson, who you can't even take one step forward in his office because he's overloaded with books.
Right. I've been here for 5 months, and
you're still settling in.
PhD students, I never tried to buy too many books. So.
Well, I hear you there, but I'm sure that the books you have there, every single one of those is in the original Dutch, I'm sure, right? So we're loaded. Anyway, another guy who's very fluent in Dutch, theological Dutch, we're very happy to welcome our friend Nathaniel Gray Sutanto, who's an assistant pastor at Covenant City Church in Jakarta, Indonesia. Welcome back, Gray. It's good to talk to you too.
Great to be here.
We've got our good buddies on today to speak about some important theology. Today we're going to be speaking about Herman Bavinck, one of our theological heroes, and one of his most important works, Philosophy of Revelation. But now there's a new annotated edition. Many of you have probably seen it. There have been some wonderful sales offered and some promotions through the Westminster bookstore. Hendrickson Publishers has been kind enough to work on this and publish this, but our guests today have edited and introduced the book, Cory Brock and Nathaniel Gray Sutanto. It also has a foreword by none other than James Eglinton, one of the premier, if not the premier, Bavinck scholar in the world. And so this is a book that has been adapted and expanded from Bavinck's 1908 Stone Lectures, which most of them were presented, well, the Stone Lectures, all of them were presented at the Princeton Theological Seminary, but he wrote a few more lectures that were not delivered there, so we're going to get into that today and talk a bit about the history and about this important theology and philosophy of Revelation and speak about the wonderful annotations. Tremendous service to the church by doing this, so thanks, brothers, for writing it and for joining us today. Before we get into the book itself, we got just a few bits of housekeeping, things to update people about. Of course, the biggest thing on our plate is Danny Olinger's biography of Gerhardus Voss, which has been printed. It's delivered. Many of you have pre-ordered the book and ordered copies after our episode last week on the subject on Christ the Center. Just so you know, that book is still for sale. You can buy it at reformedforum.org. It's, as I'm speaking, in stock at amazon.com. They had previously sold out, and they have ordered new copies from us. They've processed those, so right now there are more copies in stock. We also have a Kindle edition that you can buy through Amazon, and we're sending out a big shipment to the Westminster bookstore. We're hoping to work on some special things through them. Working out some details there, but very soon going to have it available for sale in our favorite bookstores. So just like the Philosophy of Revelation book, it's going to be available there as well. So if you'd like to get a copy, you can check out those different channels, whatever particular sales channel works for you and is best for you. If you're overseas, we know that we have some trouble, legally. We're still working out with a tax accountant to get the books, figure out how we can ship books internationally from our reformedforum.org store. So that's a holdup there. However, Westminster and certainly Amazon can get the book to you no matter where you are. And I noticed the number one sales location for our Kindle edition is Japan, of all places. So I'm always amazed at the Reformed people around the world interested in Reformed theology. We're hoping that's going to be the case today. So, brothers, let's talk a little bit then about about Herman Bavinck. We heard a little bit about Bavinck from Danny Olinger, who was talking about the relationship between Voss and Bavinck and how those families were so closely related and familiar with one another. But here we have another theological titan, and really is only perhaps starting to get his due. We're very thankful for the Bavinck scholarship and how there's been an increase, a renaissance in it recently. But it wasn't really until 2003 that the first edition in English of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatix came out that people really started to become aware of him. And I know at that time that many of the systematic theology courses at Westminster and Philadelphia, for example, started to use it as a textbook. And now we're seeing folks such as yourself and others that have now had access to Bavinck in English, which has driven them only to study and investigate him further, not just in English, in what's available in English, but even in the original Dutch. What can you guys say, just in broad terms and in general, regarding the state of Bavinck scholarship? Is it an exciting time?
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly a very exciting time, I think, with James's work and, of course, right before him, Brian Madsen's work coming out, which I think, considerably reshaped the discourse on Bavinck scholarship for sure. Because I think now there's a greater recognition of the unity of Bavinck's thought, that his organic motif cannot be reduced to something that merely came before it as if it was just a reproduction of idealist logic. And there is no contradiction in Bavinck himself, but rather that Bavinck represents one unified theology, and that is based on the organic motif. And I think that reshaping of Bavinck scholarship is really taking into place. And there's other PhD students that are in Edinburgh right now writing great theses in Bavinck, in Christology and doctrine of God, doctrine of sanctification. So a lot of things are coming out of Edinburgh as well, even as we speak.
Wow.
2019 will be a great year for Bavinck text and scholarship. We've got the Reformed Ethics that's about to come out, 3 volumes, and Gray and I and James have been working on the Christian Worldview, which will come out next fall with Crossway, and that will be the first time that text has ever appeared in English. So there's a lot of primary sources for 2019 to be on the lookout for. And in addition to that, James Eglinton's been working on a new biography, and it's going to be excellent. So 2019 should be a good year.
Now, tell us a bit about just your academic history. Of course, we know is interacting with you, but our listeners might always not be aware of where you studied in Edinburgh and how you ended up there, and how this has kind of become and has been for some time really a hotbed and like a little Bavinckian enclave of scholarship.
Right. Yeah. Edinburgh has become a school in itself that has a Bavinck enclave, and that really began with James Eglinton, who studied there, did his PhD there under Paul Nimmo and David Ferguson, and from there left and lectured at Bavinck's home seminary's theological school in Kampen in the Netherlands, and was there for 3 years. Came back to Edinburgh the year that Gray and I were coming into Edinburgh, and a group, a close, tight-knit community has formed there around Bavinck scholarship, and it was fun. It was great.
Yeah.
Well, that's tremendous. I mean, just for people like me, this is just a wonderful time to be around to read the products, the fruits of your labor. That I love Bavinck. I mean, I cannot read theological Dutch. I could spend the years of learning it, and maybe I'd be better. I know I would be better for it, but I got to make choices and make priorities in my life. Is to spend time with my children or learn Dutch. And I think as a father, I think the Lord's will for me in that is pretty clear, and my own desire as well. But having these resources in English is tremendously helpful. Even then, with distance and unless you become a Bavinck scholar, some of these things might be a little bit more difficult to access. And we've seen that with the scholarship and how it's growing. Gray, as you mentioned, reading Bavinck as a whole, and reading the organic nature to his theology is helpful, because the tendency can be to pick up on certain threads in Bavinck and perhaps to have I don't want to be overly harsh, but maybe a myopic view or an incomplete view, or filtering what you're receiving through a preconceived grid or lens. And so having annotations from people who've in large measure devoted their scholarly life to studying this man and understanding him deeply and fully is tremendously helpful. So having the annotations is like a shortcut to being able to do all this heavy lifting. I just asked, get you in the mix, Dan. I mean, have you found it helpful, similarly to the way I have? And you're actually currently researching and writing papers in the field too. Mm-hmm. But I imagine that it's wonderful to have new things showing up in journals and through the publishers as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I know even specifically these lectures here, the Philosophy of Revelation, I've been constantly encouraging people to read them, but I'm always having to qualify it, saying they're written about 100 years ago. It's not exactly easy reading, and there's certain things that are going to be difficult. So when I saw that the annotated version was coming out, I was so excited. So I've been encouraging other people to read it as well, and it's definitely going to advance Bavinck's study. Even as you guys mentioned in the introduction, how it is some of his more mature thinking, even coming after his Reformed Dogmatix. And so seeing how themes from his Prolegomena specifically come out here in this Philosophy of Revelation is just really fascinating and helpful for the church.
Mm. Yeah. Cory and Gray, I was wondering if you could introduce to us or speak a bit about the historical circumstances and the context for this book. Tell us a bit about the history. How did Bavinck eventually end up in the States to work on these lectures? What was going on at the time? What was Bavinck thinking about? And set the stage for us so that as we open up the book and start speaking about the content therein, we understand from whence it came and why.
Sure. Bavinck had done a tour of the States in 1892, and Kuyper, of course, gave the Stone Lectures just several years before Bavinck would. Bavinck was invited to give them for the end of the fall term at Princeton in 1908, and so he delivered them. We don't have exact dates, but he delivered them in the late fall of 1908, and he did a tour at that same time around the northeastern U.S., delivering lectures in Grand Rapids and in other places, Chicago, for instance. And it is some of his more mature thinking, and one of the important points to know when you read the book or read the lectures is that he intended them to be an elaboration, a sequel to his Christian worldview, which is a much more brief argument in 3 lectures, 3 chapters, that is a compact version of the Philosophy of Revelation, if you will, 4 years before that. They were immediately translated into both English and German by Voss and others, and by Herman Kuntz in Germany. And those translations were very well received at the time, and we're piggybacking on some of that work that was done in 1909. Gray, do you have anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think Bavinck was very much interested in not only saying that Revelation is, what he says is the secret behind all of existence, but also demonstrating that to be the case, and doing that in a very inductive fashion. He made sure that he indicated that Revelation solved a lot of the intellectual problems that he faced, but not in a deductive way, as if he was just proclaiming that to be the case, but rather by showing through textual evidences, through very careful argumentation, that if you just reason it out, you will end up with the inescapability of Revelation at the very end. And I think he addressed some very deep currents in German idealism and even in English scholarship. And he made sure that he demonstrated that to be the case. And I think that was his main motivation in writing the Philosophy of Revelation.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask, you've already kind of answered some of the question, but, more speaking from an historical theological standpoint, why are these particular lectures significant historically? And more than that, how do they relate to Bavinck's other works? I mean, where would you rank them if you had to, in terms of contribution, influence, importance, significance, whatever categories you want to use? Where would you place them in relation to some of the other works that we might be aware of?
Yeah. This is the second most important work that Bavinck ever accomplished, of course, and the first being the Reformed Dogmatix. And some of the reason for it was that it certainly intended to be a philosophy after Dogmatix, one that goes in assuming the fact of revelation. It's both a revelational philosophy and a philosophy that has revelation as its object. And that meant that in his mind, Dogmatix is prior to that activity. For one, another historical note is this is early 20th century. He's writing Christian Worldview in 1903 and 4. He's publishing these in 1908. And he's wrestling at the turn of the 20th century with what he saw as the death of a certain type of modernism that was taking place in the continent. And that style of modernism was one that he called, for example, evolutionary monism, materialistic, positivistic in terms of its scientific method. He saw a world that was reawakening to the possibility of revelation, and one that had been touched again by neo-Hegelianism and other things. He saw a world that was open to talking about the invisible again, and that was part of his motivation to address that in scholarship.
In the book, really right early on, just looking at Roman numeral 13, we have in the preface to the annotated edition here, Bavinck offers to the contemporary reader the most substantial alternative amid modern theologies of the 20th century, and particularly the neo-Orthodox movement, especially represented by the theology of Karl Barth. That's quite the statement, and I think quite helpful and interesting to think about the challenges of our present day and the theologies that are reigning, in one way, shape, or form, even among people that might not name Barth or others as, their theological champion or hero. We still see his program, his style of theology, his method kind of, continuing to wreak havoc among the Christian church. And then you have all sorts of other weak and feeble and perhaps even failed attempts to try to address his theology at the core. People will tend to want to deal with the leaves without dealing with the root. But it's important to see here, and especially with philosophy of revelation, how Bavinck really can address figures like Barth and other modern theologies at a root level in a way that really matters. And I don't know if everyone understands that about Bavinck.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, if I could put it this way, if the strategy of neo-orthodoxy in response to modern challenges is to simply say that revelation is, it exists in a completely different sphere of existence, or it exists in a way that is completely uncontrolled by man, which of course has some grain of truth in it, and therefore untouchable by science, and therefore in a discipline of study that is completely distinct from science and other academic. Bavinck actually argues and tries, and this is taking on a hard task, but also I think a commendable task, to demonstrate that revelation has significant scientific benefits, and not scientific just in the English sense of the word that might imply simply the empirical sciences, but the sciences as in all academic disciplines, as the Dutch word wetenschap, which is in reference to any scholarly discipline. And Bavinck actually tries to say that revelation doesn't just not exist in a different sphere from all academic disciplines, but it actually aids it in a way that makes all academic discipline able to flourish and is fruitful.
I had a question along those lines for you guys. I think along those lines at least. But Gordon Graham, in an article I think he wrote for the Calvin Theological Journal, had made the point that the sort of implicit intellectual context for these lectures was actually Nietzsche's philosophy. And Nietzsche critiquing sort of a straw man version of Christianity as idea of resignation from the world and sort of just rejecting life in itself. Do you find like Bavinck here in these lectures, as he shows the necessity of revelation for all these different disciplines, as sort of countering that? I mean, how would you assess Graham's point of it being Nietzsche having the implicit context for it?
Yeah, I think that's in the background. So I think Bavinck explicitly tackles materialism and the sense of, on the one side, denying the need for any kind of telos or the existence of the transcendence at any level, and trying to say that if we go that route, you'll actually find that you'll end up in all sorts of absurdities that actually demand the recalling back of revelation. But he's not just, I think, responding to Nietzsche's argument. He's also responding to another strand. I think someone like Edward von Hartmann in his philosophy of the unconscious, who basically argued that when you study the world empirically, you'll end up with all kinds of mysteries that cannot be answered unless you presuppose an absolute unconscious underneath all of existence. So von Hartmann appeals to this absolute to account for our perception of the empirical world. How is it that our thought corresponds to reality? And von Hartmann also appeals to this absolute unconscious to say, how do we make sense of the progress of history? How do we make sense of movement? Because if we just appeal to, the merely material, mass, inertia, objects in front of us, we can't really develop an account of knowledge or telos or purpose or development that is intelligible. So I think it's seeing that kind of observation. He's also observing, arguments from Schelling and Schelling's philosophy of revelation that's argued similarly for an organically connected universe. And Bavinck is basically saying, look, you guys are looking for the right things, but you're looking for it in the wrong places. It's true that everything is grounded and everything is united together, but we're not united together in an unconscious absolute, contra von Hartmann, or in an organic pantheism, contra Schelling, or panentheism, depending on how you read him. But rather, we're connected because God has created creation in such a way that it conforms to an organic plan, to the counsel of God. And Bavinck appeals to divine providence and the divine counsel that made all things connected in a way that conforms to a pattern of unities and diversities. And that's why we have perception. That's why we can trust our knowledge. That's why we can have notions of progress, because creation has a plan. Creation is united, even though there are diverse parts in it. And so we can avoid all kinds of reductionism. So I think, along with Nietzsche and other materialists, Bavinck is definitely responding to the pantheistic movement.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Implicit would be the key word in Graham's argument. I think I'm right in saying that Bavinck almost never interacts with Nietzsche in his entire corpus, if I remember correctly. And I don't think there's a single reference to Nietzsche in Philosophy of Revelation. And that's just coming off memory. Certainly some of that's there in the background. But it might be helpful just to say that the three primary opponents, or those with whom he's in conversation, are a neo-idealism, a early 20th century pragmatism, and different strands of evolutionary thought, Thomas Huxley, post-Darwinian, monistic tendencies towards naturalism are his three primary opponents in the work.
I think you do get a few references to it, but I think that's exactly right. He's more in the background, more implicit.
Yeah.
And those are the main,
It seems his name, I would have no idea, but just looking at the PDF, just a brief search, they're just the names where his name appears just seem to be lumped in very general statements with other folks, so it doesn't seem like he's particularly expositing anything, significant about.
Yeah.
there's so much here. I a lot of little places. I've got all sorts of questions that just you've raised that I'd like to get the answers to, just out of personal curiosity. But speaking more generally and introductory, you make an interesting statement about the title of the book. And in English we have philosophy of revelation, but you make the point about there really could be two different ways that we can understand that genitival phrase in English, which is certainly, in a sense, intended by Bavinck in the original. What is Bavinck really doing here with the philosophy of revelation, and what's the fullness of that phrase to make sure we understand the project?
Yeah, I think the way we can get at it is that I think Bavinck is trying to trace out the implications of revelation to other academic disciplines. And I think he sees the task of philosophy. Philosophy for Bavinck is a universal science, in the sense of philosophy investigates the reasons, aims, and purposes of all the other academic disciplines. And that's why all the other academic disciplines need philosophy, just as much as all the academic disciplines need theology. He makes that claim in numerous places. So a philosophy of revelation then not only investigates the how does revelation penetrate into the human consciousness, but also the ways in which revelation impacts or is required by the other academic sciences. So if a theology of revelation is an investigation of revelation from its dogmatic roots, so scripture and what scripture says about revelation, and revelation in terms of its source, the Trinity, and all those sorts of ways of thinking about revelation, a philosophy of revelation asks a horizontalized question. When I think about revelation, what is the significance of our confession of divine revelation from a triune God to the other academic disciplines? So when we think about the philosophy of revelation, we're not thinking about revelation in some general religious sense, as if we're just conceiving of it, a revelation reinvestigated by reason alone or something like that. That's not what philosophy of revelation means, but rather it's revelation externalized, so to speak, or horizontalized. How do I view revelation and its impact on the other sciences?
Yeah. In brief, I would say something like this. The main point, or the main activity, I think the main enterprise is that he's allowing the fact of revelation to discipline our investigation of the sciences. And when he does that, he's unveiling the fact that revelation makes intelligible many of the solutions that philosophical inquiry has yet to solve, particularly the unity of God, world, and humanity. That revelation, when you allow revelation to discipline your thinking, it solves problems that have remain unsolved for history of philosophy.
So we have, James Bratt, I think, put it really helpfully, and we included this in our introduction, where he argued that Bavinck's argument is, at the end, that no matter how fragmented reality seemed to be and how illuminating it could be to explore it as such in the veil of human relativity, Bavinck was sure that it all cohered in God's absolute unity, and that human life could proceed only under that assurance. And I think Bavinck was trying to demonstrate that with particular philosophical and empirical problems.
Well, you see definitely in ways how much Van Til would have been dependent upon Bavinck and Voss and others like him. They were steeped in the same tradition, and how critical and essential revelation is to his theology. Really, Bavinck is really lurking in the background to instruct Van Til on his revelational epistemology. And he's merely just kind of applying basic Reformed theological categories to the discipline of apologetics. You could do the same thing to all sorts of other fields, as we see, Bavinck interacting with many other things here. I was curious on a historical point, knowing Bavinck's times, his dates, and then, understanding a lot of the milieu that Van Til was reacting to with idealism and pragmatism. how much Bavinck was familiar with some of the same figures, or at least the undercurrents of the British absolute idealist movement, for example. You got a guy like Bernard Bosanquet, 1848 to 1923, and then many of the other figures of that ilk really kind of presenting that same kind of notion of that personality, even if it's an unconscious, that kind of binds all of reality together, that without this thing that kind of keeps everything integrated, and then without having knowledge that corresponds to that reality, we just can't have knowledge. So Bavinck just really, in a way, seems to explicate, the impossibility of the contrary for all of these things. Kind of the same way that Van Til does with the problem of the one and the many. He's not always really super precise with the way he describes that, or working as an analytical philosopher on some of those things, which kind of maddens some philosophers in terms of what he does. But he's getting at this general basic problem, like how do you explain for unity and diversity in the world, and how do we explain things like us knowing when we don't know everything? How could we have some sort of a foundation for anything? And then from that he ends up with his teaching and principles of there are no brute facts and things like that. Bavinck's covering the same territory in a way. Maybe Van Til's cribbing off Bavinck's lessons here and just developing them in some new directions.
I thought, I forget Matston's book, rather an article that he wrote, because when he was making the point where Van Til had critiqued Bavinck on certain points regarding his realism and stuff, that they were actually closer friends than Van Til even thought at times, and there's clearly the influence of Bavinck on Van Til's thought. At least I see that.
Do you guys ever come across areas where the Bavinck was dealing with those figures, the British side of things, or not, or is it mostly all continental?
Yeah, I think you get some passing references to Green and maybe Bosanquet, but it is interesting. I mean, I think just off my memory here, there were portions in the philosophy of revelation that refer to the absolute, and he actually used the English, like the absolute. So it's all Dutch.
Really?
You have this absolute and it's in English.
Well, that's interesting.
And but no reference to it. Like he doesn't footnote anything, But in most other cases, when he talks about the absolute, he uses the German or uses the Dutch, and he would refer to the unconscious, and he would, when he's referring to von Hartmann, he's using the German, Unbewussten, So it's not that. So he's very, I think, self-conscious in his references, and Cory might be able to talk about this more, but his reference to Schleiermacher is using very precise, terms from Schleiermacher himself. So I would think that when he refers to the absolute,
in the English, he did that with intent.
Yeah, I think so. But you get hints. But I think definitely his primary focus was the continent. Yeah.
It's worth probably adding. Just that's one of the main reasons that we undertook this project. Is we noticed that when we were doing our dissertations on Bavinck, we noticed how often throughout his corpus he switches languages in the middle of his prose, and he very often writes in German, by far the most, in addition to his Dutch, but also French and English as well from time to time. And oftentimes it will be quotations or brief phrases that you would find directly in another thinker that are never cited. Right. And when that gets translated to English without any reference, it's impossible, or difficult at least, to tell exactly what he's trying to do. He's to signal to the reader exactly who he's thinking of, who he's working from, in an age that had, of course, different standards of citation. And we, in our new annotated edition, wanted to highlight that throughout.
Well, it's also with a word that is used by many philosophers. Like, even if we didn't cite it, but all of a sudden I just whipped out the word Dasein, you know who I'm referring to. It's exactly. Heidegger, and even though that's a foreign word, no one else uses that philosophically in the way that he does. It's his term. Right, but with absolute, who knows? It could be all sorts of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating. Interesting little tidbit. Is that a scoop? Does that qualify as a theological scoop that we breaking news here? I don't know.
I built my dissertation around it, so I hope so.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, that's really good. Well, let's start talking about some of these lectures. I mean, in terms of the things he's focusing on, the idea of a philosophy of revelation, we've been touching upon that. But what are some things that you two fine editors would like to highlight regarding this book, or perhaps some gems in here that you think are particularly worthy for the people that are going to be picking up and reading this book for the very first time?
I had a quick question maybe before you jump into that, where you speak about the subjective side of revelation and even the idea of revelatory pressure. I think it's Bavinck's phrase. Mm-hmm. Would you like to explain that? Because I think we often think of revelation as something external to us, mm-hmm. But thinking about the subjective side of revelation might be really helpful. So if you want to explore that.
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that's something that is uniquely romantic in Bavinck, that Bavinck is introducing into the doctrine of general revelation. So Bavinck affirmed the classical Reform understanding of general revelation, namely that God has revealed himself in our conscience, the moral order, and that God in the external order has revealed to us, something of his greatness, his providence, and so forth. But I think he's also, on top of that, adding what, he said is the subjective side of revelation, namely the imprint of God's revelation in our consciousness. And I actually argued in a recent article in the IJST that for him, this revelatory pressure on one's consciousness is felt rather than thought. But for Bavinck, feeling is not a separate faculty from knowing. Rather, he argued in his Principles of Psychology, which hasn't been adequately translated yet, he argued there that feeling is actually a function of the knowing faculty. So, oftentimes we think about, the faculties of our minds or our beings, and we think there's feelings and emotions on the one hand, and then there's thinking and reasoning on the other. And knowing is just reasoning, and feeling is not reasoning. Bavinck actually argues there that what you feel contributes to knowledge just as much as thinking. And so revelation actually impacts us in our consciousness. So he's got some very interesting examples in that book where he argued that, you often are aware or are, certain things that you're not actually conscious about. So he talks about walking around buildings that is very familiar to you. You know where these buildings are located, and you might be lost in some other thought, train of thought. But you're walking over these buildings and crossing these rows as if you knew them, but you were never really thinking about them. And I think that's just an interesting example that he notes. And in the philosophy of revelation, this is going to come out especially in lecture 3 in Revelation of Philosophy, where he argues that one knows God not simply by thinking about God, propositions about God, but rather one knows God because we have a feeling of absolute dependence. And that's something that Cory could talk about because he built his entire dissertation on that.
At the heart of the argument in philosophy of revelation, he begins by saying that the possibility of engaging in any science or in any art depends upon the revelation of the self to the self. That the first thing that happens to all of us is that we awaken in our lives to being a self, to having an ego, to being an I, a me. And his argument using Schleiermacher is that consciousness, the self-consciousness of self, being able to be an I in any activity that we perform is the first proof, the first fact that reveals that revelation and faith is at the heart, at the bottom of all scientific activity and endeavor. And maybe I don't know if we want to get into the details on exactly how he picks up on the feeling of absolute dependence there. It's a little technical, but
by all means, let's go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's what we do.
Yeah.
Follow the thread.
Yeah. So in chapter 3, for example, he picks up exactly on Schleiermacher's phrasing. He uses it even in the German. He refers to immediate self-consciousness and the feeling of absolute dependence. And he talks about our immediate self-consciousness, by which he's referring to our awareness of self as self, which is not something we come to through the reasoning process. It's not an empirical discovery. It's something that arrives to us in the domain of feeling, which Gray explained just a moment ago. Feeling is an aspect of knowing for Bavinck in his psychology. It's a way of knowing. It's not a reference to the emotions, nor was it for Schleiermacher either. It's a way of knowing. And what he's saying is that in our immediate self-consciousness, we realize ourselves to be dependent, right? First, we realize ourselves to be dependent on other things in the world. We know that we cannot be without our mothers, and we know that we cannot be without all sorts of things, that our own personal identity is dependent upon things in this world. But immediately, as soon as you start to process this and realize this, you also know that all of these other objects in the world are also dependent. They're dependent upon you. They get their identity as well from your existence. Mm-hmm. And so what he says, using Schleiermacher as one of his examples of how God works, of how God reveals himself in the immediacy of self-consciousness, is that we immediately all, through revelation, because of God's revelation, are aware that there is that upon which we depend upon absolutely, beyond all relative dependence. It's that from which we get our own consciousness, our own selves. In other words, he's arguing that the self is a primordial gift, and it's a common grace, if you will, and that the realization of self, the faith in the existence of my own consciousness, is the ground of all other activity in the world. We couldn't do anything else without it. And it's the first place that God reveals himself in the giving of that gift to the human consciousness to human consciousness.
So how then is that qualified or understood, through something like the Imago Dei, the image of God, versus what we might find with Descartes' indubitable, for example?
Well, I mean, I'd have to brush up again on Descartes. It's been some time, but what I can say,
well, kind of for him, just I guess, is just this necessary foundation, but it's something he arises at from that process of doubt, right? So that's very different. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. I'm not trying to ask a trick question, but it just seems a much, he's picking up on maybe a tiny grain of truth that Descartes understood, that I can't doubt my own existence. In a sense, like if there's one thing I can't doubt, it's that I'm thinking and I'm the one doubting. We understand that apart from a biblical worldview and a biblical understanding, Descartes not really offering a properly qualified theology as revealed by God, but Bavinck's kind of seems to be, at least as you're describing this, seems to be getting at the same kind of investigation truth, but doing it in a way that's a lot more consistent with the biblical witness and actually understands things according to revelation. And the reason we have this awareness and knowledge, it's a gift of God and ultimately a function of, or at least attendant to, being made in his image.
Right. I mean, well, you said it. I mean, I think you gave a great answer. That the difference between Descartes and Bavinck on this point is that Bavinck is arguing that the only possibility for explaining, for grounding the self, the realization of self as self, is revelation, is the fact of revelation. It's recognizing faith in God at the bottom of all possibility of human knowing, acting, willing. And for him, that begins psychologically in feeling and of course there he's picking up on that very German tradition in the early 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Gray, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think it might be helpful to go over one of Bavinck's arguments. I think if chapter 3 laid out his basic definition of how revelation came about psychologically, and I would even argue logically and chronologically, I think in chapter 4, 5, and so on, he actually tries to demonstrate how that actually helps the other sciences. So it might be helpful to just take a look at chapter 5 as one test case, revelation and history.
Yeah.
Of how he tries to concretely show that revelation is helpful to the discipline of history at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So in chapter 5 in Philosophy of Revelation, his basic strategy in showing how revelation is necessary, how revelation is helpful to generate, the productivity in the academic sciences, is that if you think with revelation and with God as the triune being in the back of it, you will avoid all kinds of reductionisms and uniformities. I think that's his basic strategy. He would argue thought that does not begin with the reality of God's revelation will end up reducing the phenomena with which they're studying, or the phenomena that they are studying. So, and in history, it's a big test case for that. So in chapter 5, in Revelation and History, he argues that the scholarship of history in his day ends up attributing to history a monistic doctrine of causality, that's page 100, and a monistic evolutionary conception of history. So a monistic doctrine of causality and a monistic evolutionary conception of history, that's page 101. So he argues that Marx is a clear example of that, because Marx basically argues that the way to understand history is by reducing it to class and economic conflicts. That's the key to understanding all of history. So why does history evolve the way that it does? Why is history shifting the way that it does? Well, understand class and economic struggles, and you've unlocked all of history. And Bavinck talks about Schopenhauer and other thinkers that might divide, all of history under very distinct and concrete stages of development, as if, history could be neatly divided like that. Well, Bavinck argues that if you begin with revelation, however, you don't have the temptation to reduce all things to one bare cause, or successive stages of neatly compartmentalized phases of evolution. Not merely, if you think about history that way, Bavinck actually argues in a very prescient way that you'll end up arguing that your culture is the most developed kind, or one specific race, one specific philosophy is the master philosophy that all of history had been pointing to from the very beginning. And Bavinck argues that that's a kind of imperialistic triumphalism that he actually notes is part and parcel of much of German philosophy. Frozen again.
Yeah, see, that's tough. We'll wait for him to call back in again.
Well, do you want to jump on something?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Go ahead, Dan, if you got something.
Yeah, because he had used the language of side by side or one after another, which is, I think, language that appears throughout the lectures, if I'm correct. So, for example, in the Revelation History chapter, he says that in all these distinctions, so all these various diversities that we find, it's forgotten that the relations and conditions, which are thus placed in a series one after another, exist throughout the ages, side by side in different peoples, and even within the same people in different strata of society. So my question, Cory, I guess now since Gray's gone, is that side by side language almost like organic language, in the sense of that they're existing at the same time rather than in a sort of univocal or a sequential way? Do you find that like his language of side by side being significant throughout the lectures?
That's interesting. I haven't ever specifically noticed it. There you go.
I'm back.
That's an insight.
Hey, yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Gray. Sorry about that technical problem. Cory,
really.
Cory's answering a question here, so just jump on in.
Well, Gray, you might can help with this. Dan pointed out that
I think he's frozen again. Oh, there he is. Good.
Oh my goodness!
Do you think switching to audio only might be better, or
that's up to Gray? We can give it one more shot. But Gray, if you get locked up again, maybe next time just call in the audio, and that'll save you some bandwidth. But let's go with it while it's working. Go ahead, Cory.
Well, Dan had pointed out a theme, a motif, where Bavinck uses the language side by side in a way.
Right.
Do you have thoughts on that?
So where was I cut off just now? Do you know?
It was post your Marx comment.
Yes. Right. So Bavinck is arguing that if you have revelation in the back of your philosophy of history, he would argue that you are free now to see history not as if it's one phase following another, but rather all kinds of phenomena are always pre-existing and coexisting with one another side by side. And that's an important phrase. You're right in pointing that out. So he argues that when you look at the ancient peoples, you actually see a lot of technological advancements and philosophical depth. So it's not as if, you had, philosophical immaturity and then you ended up with philosophical maturity. That he says that that's an argument that is typified by a lot of German philosophy, that they always typify some kind of German philosophy as the master philosophy toward which all of history is pointing to. But rather, if you now just simply, let go of the desire to reduce all of history under one cause or one evolutionary conception, you're actually free to look at the expansiveness of all of history and the expansiveness of all of human civilization. And he argues very specifically that revelation is necessary for that. He argues that if you have revelation and if you have a divine counsel, then you recognize that history is what he says, in a true sense, truly possible, a history of the world and history of humanity in which all men, all peoples, nay, all creatures are embraced and are held together by one leading thought, namely by one counsel of God. And so because God's counsel is rich and multiformed and holds all things in unity and diversity, you would expect that in human life, in all of human history, a rich phenomena of different things would coexist side by side.
Yeah,
that's helpful.
He connects it nicely on page 114 to what we've already discussed as well, the relationship between the unity of history and the unity of the self, the ichheit, the I-ness of the self. He says, just as soul and body and man are not genetically one and have not originated from each other, and yet form in the ego, the I of man, an inner organic unity, so the matter stands with every man and every people in history, and also with all humanity. So he connects it really nicely there with what we've already been discussing.
That's tremendous. Yeah, that's really powerful. You think about that philosophy of history, contra folks like Arnold Toynbee or Marx, as you mentioned, it's tremendous. It's so much richer than what the dominant or prevailing academic models might present.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think it's specifically haunting if you think about what's going to happen in the 1940s with perpetuated by Nazi Germany. And I think Bavinck was very prescient that might be what would be happening. That if you think this way, that if you conceive of history as simply a bunch of successive phases that anticipates one particular nation or one particular people as the most advanced, then you're going to end up reducing all the other peoples. And we need a philosophy of revelation that can actually do justice to the diversity of peoples and the diversity that we find in history.
And it's worth saying that he does make exactly those predictions in chapter 10, Revelation of the Future, where he ties his philosophy of history to the possibilities of eugenics in the coming 20th century and says some shockingly brilliant things by way of prophecy in terms of what would come in Germany. So, yeah.
Ideas have consequences, right?
Right.
There's no accident. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. I was going to ask, so at the end of this chapter on Revelation and history, he speaks of Christ as being at its very center. And for example, he says, "But think Christ away for a moment, with all he has spoken and done and wrought, immediately history falls to pieces. It has lost its heart, its kernel, its center, its distribution," and so on from here. What role? I mean, because then I guess that's getting at the part of the relationship, or the organic relationship between special revelation, general revelation. But in what way did Bavinck see Christ as the center of this history, and in what way does it fall apart if we lose Christ?
Yeah,
Well,
I think we. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, he mentions the fact that when we start considering not merely the gift of general revelation, but special revelation, that we realize that Jesus Christ, he says, is himself history, that he is the kernel and the true content of all history. Christianity, he summarizes, is itself history. And that's what the gift of special revelation offers, that's more than distinct from general, considered without its organic unity with special. But Gray, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And another layer on top of that is his understanding that Christ is the organic head of the second humanity. Right. So he argues that the first head, of course, was Adam, and all humanity was organically contemplated in Adam. And the second organic head is Jesus Christ. And without, by definition, an organism is something that conforms to the shape of a unity in diversity. And without Adam and without Christ, Bavinck contends, you'll only have disparate, particulars, and not really a unity in diversity. And especially when we're thinking about history, where it's not just surveying natural phenomena, but you're actually looking at the history of people groups together. You need to understand them in terms of who their federal heads is. You need to be able to understand them in terms of redemptive history, in terms of the sins of Adam, in terms of what Christ is doing to renew humanity. So I think that's what he meant there as well.
Right. So would he see an organic relationship between what we might speak of as redemptive history and just history in general? They're not so much separate categories, but there's even a priority maybe to the redemptive history, or a centering of it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely only a pragmatic distinction, I think, between the two. He argued that general and special revelation each require one another to be intelligible. And I think he meant that in a real way, that they're both to be connected in such a way where, any distinction that we make between them needs to take into account their inherent unity.
Yeah, he says that if you think Christ away for even a moment, if you forget Christ for even a moment, then history loses its heart, its kernel, its core, and becomes nothing but a distribution of random races and people groups acting in time, that Christ is the unifying center of all peoples and therefore of all history.
Oh, maybe something that was helpful that I saw, I'm forgetting what page it was on, maybe 83 or so, regarding the natural laws, and how Bavinck makes the point that these natural laws assume or are only really valid within a theistic worldview, which seems to be very similar. Well, actually, let me ask the question. When he's speaking about these natural laws, is he thinking specifically of gravity or something like that? Or does he have more even of like causality and various other things in mind? Which it sounds very similar to say with something that Van Til would argue for regarding the natural laws, where they're valid, the Christian, even certain evidences for God, but they're only valid within a theistic worldview. Like they assume that to begin with. So Bavinck, for example, will say that these natural laws, like a law assumes a lawgiver, and so there has to be something behind these laws. So, I guess, to what extent is he using the idea of natural laws? Like, what are these laws?
In that specific text, it's just important to note that he uses the phrase "the laws of nature," and not what is often referred to as the natural law.
Right.
So you said it yourself. I mean, there he's referring to the actual fact of nature in motion and God's upholding of seed time and harvest and gravity and Newton's laws as we describe them, etc. And not referring, in this moment at least, to the impression of the moral order upon human consciousness that is often called the natural law.
But is there more to it than that as well, like expanding that, even to things like causality? I guess that would be included. But I kind of get where you're coming from, Dan, in terms of the breadth of that phrase. Mm-hmm. I guess there's a way that we could kind of think of it in a contemporary scientific setting, and law is a very specific thing for a natural scientist. And it's really helpful to clarify that he's not at this moment speaking about natural law amidst current discussions on that subject. That's, Romans 1, etc. That's really important. But how broad is it? Is it God's overall covenantal sovereign care over the whole world, or is he speaking maybe to a subset of those things that might be the more, not in Bavinck's use of the term science or scientific, but in terms of how we might understand the subject.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just wrote on chapters 4 and 5 for a paper that I'm about to present in LA. So this is providential that this came up. But in chapter 4 specifically, so when he talks about natural laws and laws of nature there, I think he does have in mind not just, specific laws like gravity, but also general laws like, even notions of causality as broad as that. For sure. And I think what he's trying to argue in that specific chapter is argue against two kinds of reductionisms again as well. So the first kind is mechanistic causality, where the people like Ernst Haeckel or other materialists would argue that causes are really an aggregate of different parts moving around together, of physical parts. So there's a kind of physicalism, materialism there. But then on the other hand, he argues against this, what he calls vitalism, that argues that causes are not really an aggregate, or not really the product of an aggregate of material parts coming together in unique ways, but rather that underneath the material parts, there's an energy, a force, a substance. And again, he brings up Edward von Hartmann there. Another one that he brings up is Wilhelm Ostwald. And both of these figures argue that materialism can't make sense of causality. You put matter on top of one another. You can't say that they cause one another.
Or you have like Hume or Kant. The critical subject for Kant just imposes it on the bare phenomena, and Hume just for lack of a better, more nuanced way to put it, just it's imagined.
Precisely, yeah. So von Hartmann and Ostwald would argue that, without quoting Kant or Hume, but they would argue in similar ways that all you would have is just one particular on top of another particular without any real activity connecting one to the other. So they argued that there had to be some kind of vital energy, vital activity, and von Hartmann ultimately the unconscious absolute, Wilhelm Ostwald some, incomprehensible force or energy. And Bavinck is arguing neither can ground a coherent notion of causality or development or of organic growth in a way that is intelligible. Materialists, of course, can't make sense of it for all the reasons vitalists say, but vitalists, on the other hand, also can't really express what it is they mean by this unconscious. How do they know that this unconscious absolute even exists? How do they know that this energy is even there underneath the material things? They can't make sense of that. And so Bavinck actually lands in page 79, he argues there that revelation actually allows you to hold both things in tension. You don't have to reduce matter into energy, and you don't have to reduce energy into matter, but rather both are making valid observations, but they're just not making it in a way that is able to preserve the two things together in a unity and diversity kind of fashion. So, Dan, you asked about, is there more to that? He's saying that it's only valid under a theistic framework. Yes, but I want to be precise there. And I have a section of my thesis that compares Bavinck and Kuyper on this. And I think for Kuyper, if the unregenerate man doesn't really know science and the regenerate man knows science, Bavinck is making a simultaneously more modest, but also a more, but also at the same time a very ambitious claim. He's making the more modest claim because he's saying unregenerate science can produce real knowledge. He would actually say that.
Yeah.
But it's mechanical knowledge. It's not, it's a one-sided knowledge. It's a reductionist kind of knowledge, but it's still real knowledge. They're making observations about good things, about phenomena, but it's not organic knowledge. So Bavinck argues that the difference between unregenerate knowing and regenerate knowing is not between ignorance and knowledge, but rather between mechanical knowing and organic knowing. And I sense that I think Van Til is probably going to side more with Kuyper rather than with Bavinck on this point.
Yeah, he has that psychological epistemological distinction, which is
exactly, yeah,
maybe not the most helpful use of terms, but for him it would say, unbelievers do know things truly, but not rightly. In some way, it can end up being kind of like an ethical thing. But obviously, the unbelievers can know 2 + 2 = 4, but they can't understand it rightly and upon the proper foundations, and therefore, unbelievers, being darkened in their understanding, don't know anything correctly and rightly because they don't subject their knowledge to the triune God, and they can't account for it because they try to explain their own knowledge, in an autonomous way. So that's what he means by that. And so the critics that want to say, well, Van Til, says unbelievers can't know anything. Clearly they know some things, therefore Van Til's wrong. That's not exactly what Van Til was talking about. But it is tremendously interesting to compare Bavinck and Van Til perhaps on this revelational epistemology, and to think how interesting, and then you could also bring in Warfield and Kuyper on this. It sounds like a book waiting to happen.
Exactly. I actually think that the distinction between psychology and epistemology is very helpful. I think and I wonder, again, so Bavinck argues that revelation happens in the psyche. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Soul there for those, Greek, psyche. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Very good. Well, brothers, this has been a tremendously fruitful discussion. I would like to follow up and talk more about this on into the future. And perhaps we could involve some other folks too to get some different questioners coming at you. But I'm always not just satisfied, but just happy to just pick your brains on these subjects because it's really helpful. But before I let you go, I wanted to ask about the cover, and you make a comment about this of I get the Dutch pronunciation correct, but I believe Piet Mondrian, and the artist that you're using in terms of what's on the cover of the actual printed book. Could you speak to him? What's the relationship and really what's the statement being made, not only in his art, but also in the inclusion of his art in the cover of this particular book?
Right. Well, Mondrian was a Dutch painter about 20 years younger than Bavinck. And if you look at Mondrian's early career, he was mostly painted in the abstract, a lot of landscapes and things like that. And it's regularly noted that his transition to Cubism was largely derivative of his relationship to theological exploration. He was into the theosophical primarily, and a lot of that had to do with his relationship to Dutch Reformed theology, of which he was very much embedded in the culture of the late 19th, early 20th century, and has turned towards primary color, sharp line, cubism, and things like that. I think we have a quote in the book where he says, he wrote that for him that the spiritual began to merge with the secular, and it became more apparent that the spiritual did not reside merely in religious subject matter, which is a very Dutch Reformed theological way of thinking about the organic nature of reality. Yeah. So, Gray, you have something to add?
Yeah. We owe Robert Cavolo a thanks here for his insights, because that's really his field of study here. He was a faculty member in Biola University's Torrey Honors Institute, and he studied, the relationship between Bavinck and aesthetics and the arts specifically. And he made the very interesting insight that we included in the note there, that Mondrian's return to primary lines and basic colors is a desire to indicate that no matter how complex visual aesthetics get, you can't get behind primary colors and basic lines. And in other words, basic lines, primary colors,
irreducible.
It's irreducibly there. So no matter how complex your art is, it's always going to be composed of that. So he wants to return to these basic forms to communicate that art, to show that this is always what's behind the more complex. And I think that's a nice way of putting it. And we owe Robert Cavallo thanks there.
Yeah, that's tremendous. I really appreciated that, and it just I wouldn't have thought about it. I mean, the book caught my eye. I was like, that's an interesting cover. But then when I read it, I thought, wow, this is a really tremendous, interesting thing to think about. And I think for a lot of people unstudied, such as myself, you might see a work of abstract art such as that and think, well, that looks simple. Well, that's the point. There's a lot more to it, and understanding what the artist is attempting to communicate and the philosophy. Now, I can't say every artist is self-conscious that way, but we appreciate those who are doing art in a way.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Cory and Gray, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and Dan, thanks also for joining us. But brothers, thanks for editing this book, and I can only say, I'll speak on behalf of everyone at Reformed Forum and all the listeners. Thank you, and we hope to see more from you in the future on this subject and others.
Thank you, Camden.
Yeah, anytime. Well, we're going to have to have you back very soon, and hopefully we could do a lot more in the field and talk about these things, because I think it's on the cutting edge, and definitely it's needed in terms of meeting the theological challenges that are out there for the church. And Bavinck is certainly somebody we want to plumb the depths of and understand as much as we can, and apply his insights to our present day. He's well worth the time. So you can visit us online at reformedforum.org. If people want to follow up, you can find out information about all of our programs, as well as a way to get in touch with us. You can order the Voss book, but if you'd like to order this book, Philosophy of Revelation, a new annotated edition, edited by our guest today, and with a foreword by James Eglinton. It's published by Hendrickson Publishers, but you can get a copy of it. I'm looking at the website right now, on sale for $19.83 at WTSbooks.com, WTSbooks.com. We'll have a link to that in the episode description. Also, on the website at Westminster is Herman Bavinck on Preaching and Preachers, which I believe is edited and put together, translated and edited by James Eglinton. That's available there as well. A good deal on that for just over $15. You can grab them both. If you missed out on the killer sale they had a week or two ago, I think both were running at 50% off or so. But you can still get them at an affordable price. WTSbooks.com. Thanks everybody for listening. We hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.